I saw a grown dogman cry. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've got a story that is about a dogman, but it's very hard for me to tell. It makes me cry each and every time I tell it, so I try to not even think about it more than once or twice a year. I don't know how much of it will translate to people who never met this dogman themselves. I will do my best to be as descriptive as I can be. I'm hoping I can tell this story well, because this was a special guy who deserved to be remembered properly. I believe he earned the right to be remembered and respected because of the way I saw him respecting and remembering others. That might sound like a strange thing to say about an animal, and that's because it is a strange thing to say about an animal. This whole story is a strange thing if you ask me. If you want to use it, please keep the facts straight and keep me anonymous, thanks. I still live exactly where I did when this all happened in the 1990s, although half of my neighborhood from back then no longer exists. I'd better not get specific about where this happened, but it is in the Midwest of America, and it's not far from a few officially recognized dogman sightings. If I were to tell you the exact location, it probably wouldn't surprise most of you. It's a place where one might expect a dogman sighting to come from, let's just put it that way. I grew up being told stories about the dogman by my dad, but at the same time, my mother never seemed to know what he and I were talking about. That's the other thing about the dogman. Even in the places where he is most commonly seen, probably half the people don't even know what a dogman is. So you have to remember how rare something like that is, and how little they might choose to be in human areas. Predators prefer being the only predator, and they prefer being the most dangerous one too. Why would a dogman go into a human hunting spot if there are more remote woods he can hunt in where rifles and crossbows are far less common? This is why, in my opinion, most sightings of these beasts are random, because if we're seeing it, it's probably wandered off its path or gotten lost. Well, this story is an exception to that rule. There was a little old lady at the far edge of my neighborhood when I first moved in with my wife in the 90s. This lady we'll call Melanie wore her long straight hair in bangs down to her eyelids from when she was 17 through when she was in her 80s. That's when I met her. In her house, she had a piano lined with photos of her at every age, and there was always that same haircut. It used to be dark brown when she was young, yet had become entirely silver by the time I had become her friend and neighbor. This was a woman bursting with happiness every time I saw her. We took to visiting each other once or twice a week, sharing tea and stories. Melanie had a lot of stories, as she had worked in show business on the East and West coasts. She had anecdotes about the mishaps and foibles of some pretty famous people. Melanie had seen the most beautiful people from their ugliest sides, and I suppose that was why she retired almost directly in the center of the country, literally as far from both coasts as she could physically manage to be. Still, the years of union work in Hollywood and New York had bought her a lovely home, with twice as much land in the back as our place. My wife Betty, who was a full-time housewife once we moved out there, also became good friends with Melanie. In fact, Betty told me about the werewolf long before I ever saw it myself. Now, I was a busy man in those days, working, commuting, and competing for status in my field. All this on top of trying to support myself and my wife in a fashion better than our parents had provided for us. I might have been in the last generation that lived that American dream, but I lived it with full gusto. So I don't want to hear any complaints from the peanut gallery about the fact that I didn't take my wife literally when she told me that our neighbor Melanie had a friend who was a werewolf. I just didn't know what she meant, and it didn't seem important enough for me to ask her to clarify. I figured she was talking about a large dog, or maybe she had a stuffed werewolf doll. I don't know. But since she was laughing when she told me about it, I figured it was just some cute lady thing. In those days, I was considered somewhat progressive just because I humored my wife, unlike some of my work colleagues. How sweet. The little missus is talking about a wolf man. So cute. When I dropped by Melanie's place for lunch one Saturday with Betty, our meal was interrupted when an animal that I first took to be an adult lion appeared at the tree line behind Melanie's house and made a grunting noise. Melanie at once popped up and waved to the creature to stay put. Then she shouted that she'd be right back. Quickly apologizing to me and Betty, Melanie trotted inside. I watched in bemusement at first, but when Betty whispered to me that this was the werewolf that she had told me about, I did a double take at that creature. It did appear somewhat canine, but it was unlike any sort of dog or cat that I'd seen in my life. The coloring was like a lion, so I at least got that part right. The face was flat and long, so almost humanoid, I thought. I was very confused looking at it, but then it kind of just pulled itself upward, or at least its front end lifted up off the ground. Do you know what I mean? It started out standing on all fours, the way a lion or dog should stand, but by the end, it was standing up like you or me on its hind legs. I felt like I had been pulled into a different reality, and I had a sudden urge to go to the bathroom. It was literally a werewolf I was looking at. I mean, something that looked like a werewolf once it stood up. It was a dog, and yet it was a man. Werewolf is a pretty good word to describe what I was looking at. He had too long a snout to be a human, and yet too flat a face to be a dog. He was a wolf man, or a dog man. Melanie emerged from the house and ran past us, carrying various kinds of meats and linked sausages. I wanted to stop her from running toward that beast, but that woman was even more full of joy than ever, as she ran toward that heinous-looking predator. Melanie ran to the woodline and gave the meats to the creature, who dropped to all fours and began scarfing some of the stuff down right away. I heard Melanie shouting at him to save some for the road, but that was a hungry giant monster that she had given all that armful of meat to. I watched, feeling unable to do anything else except observe and try not to faint. I had to tell myself to breathe. I had to think about breathing to make it happen, because that was how unsure my entire life had become once I saw that my pretty little silly wife had not been being silly at all. She wasn't exaggerating, and she wasn't being cute when she warned me that our neighbor had a pet werewolf. My wife was just telling me something that she knew, and she wanted me to know. I was feeling numbed into shock by something that Betty had given me fair warning about, and I learned a lesson about trusting her on that day. I had been treating her input like she was a child, but all along she had actually been a good partner who was looking out for me. I tried to act like I didn't want to wet myself and curl into a fetal position for her sake. After all, she didn't seem that frightened of the dogman. Of course, it was 30 or 40 feet away, and it was getting fed, so there probably wasn't any reason to be as scared as I was. I don't know, maybe it's just a woman thing. They seem to like dogmen. When the creature trotted off with its meat, Melanie jogged back inside to wash her hands. Then she returned to the table with us in the backyard. Apologizing again, Melanie said that the dogman was leaving for the season, and she wanted to see him off with some food. My wife asked if he migrated south for the winter, and Melanie got a thoughtful look on her face. She thought about it for a while. Then she admitted that she really had no idea where he did go, just that he showed up in the later spring and stayed till early autumn. She could tell when he was getting ready to leave by certain behaviors changing, like he would start to bulk up for his travels. So Melanie said she used to think that he migrated south to Louisiana in the winter and became a rougarou for the season. Then she started to hear about the stories of dogmen up in French Canada, and began to wonder if he traveled north in the winter and became a loup-garou instead. One thing's for certain, though, she told me with a wink. In either case, old Leo is speaking French all winter. Oh, that was another thing. She called him Leo, and it was for the same reason I initially thought I was seeing a lion. He was the size of a lion, for one thing, and he was colored like one for another. His hair seemed thicker around his head in a way that sort of resembled a lion's mane, but also sort of resembled a mullet. There certainly was a regal nature to his appearance and the way he carried himself, but he was definitely more canine than feline. For instance, he would wag his tail and pant with his tongue out when Melanie went over to him. He was expressing happiness in a canine way. If a feline wags its tail, that means it's very unhappy, or at least annoyed. This creature wagged its tail when it was happy, so that was not a cat. Melanie had known in advance, without the aid of human language, that the dogman was going away for the winter. That's a level of symbiosis that most marriages can't even attain. That's probably the part that most impressed me back then, and I spent a lot of time that winter asking Melanie questions about this creature. Melanie told us a number of anecdotes about the big upright canine, and in all of them, she talked about the creature as though he were just a sweet puppy. She didn't seem afraid of his size. She didn't seem aware that he was a wild animal. And she wasn't bothered in the slightest that she was probably smaller than half the game he subsisted on in the wild. To Melanie, he was her good and loyal friend, and that was all there was to that. Like, she told us the reason that we had to drive into the post office to get our mail. It was because we were so far out that the post office had to actually auction off the route that we live on to get a member of the public to deliver our mail. And since the dogman loved Melanie and frequented this route, nobody wanted to take the gig. Any profitability this route might have had was eaten up by the presence of an upright walking canine who thought it was funny to chase down delivery people. When I asked Melanie why she didn't give the dogman a talking to and explained to him that delivery people are not to be messed with, she looked at me like I was crazy. "You want me to talk him out of having a sense of humor?" she asked me. Well, when you put it that way, I suppose not. So, besides scaring off the delivery of the mail and eating a lot of raw meat whenever he'd see her, I wasn't sure what the positives were to having the dogman around. I mean, he was big enough to take down a horse, so why would we want him around our homes? What if we get a pet? What if we have children? And why was I the only one asking these questions? The women seemed completely in the thrall of this lion-headed dogman. You would have thought he was a celebrity the way they talked about him. In the back of Melanie's land was a strange marker that looked to me like a grave. It was shaped like a bone attached to a stick, though. You know, a cartoon shape of a bone. I asked her about it and she laughed. You see, one year as a present, she gave Leo a big cow bone to gnaw on. It was a very special thing to him, and he would bury it in a different place each autumn. Melanie would mark the spot for him with that bone marker, and then she would prepare a feast of meat for his next visit. That was because the visit after burying his bone was the one when he would say goodbye until the spring. Those two kind of had their own little culture, it seems. With each story Melanie told us, Betty and I longed for the spring, to get to see this creature again for ourselves. In the background of all of this, there was a looming measure to reroute a major highway through the part of town that Melanie lived in. That winter, the measure took on heat, and half our town got frozen out. Melanie was offered a fair price for her home, but she felt a need to stay until the spring at least, in order to tell her dogman friend what was happening. She brought her case up, asking for a delay of a few months. None of us thought was so unreasonable. Nonetheless, her pleas were ignored. She couldn't get any media to cover her story, as they all seemed to have been paid off by interests involved in running the highway through the town. This really crushed Melanie, and it was my wife who discovered that Melanie had passed away by herself in bed one morning. Plans were rushed to rip the houses down long before the highway needed to begin construction. It was almost as if the politicians took some kind of morbid glee in tearing down what had once been such a happy place. In spring, I took a leave of absence from work, and I bought myself some camping equipment. Betty handled things at home alone for a while, as I set up camp on the land behind where Melanie's house had once been. Once I was there, I just sort of stayed there, listening and watching. It was after a full week of sleeping there when I first caught sight of the creature. It was the Dogman. It was Melanie's Dogman, and it was clear that he was already confused and stressed. Not only was Melanie's house gone, so was her neighbor's home, and a number of landmarks, including a large boulder. I grabbed the package I had prepared for this occasion and I began to walk slowly in the direction of the beast. I kept reminding myself that I was doing this for Melanie, not for myself, and that I had to be brave. For her. For her. This had nothing to do with me. This was me delivering a message for a friend, and that was all. I had nothing to fear. I had nothing to fear. I had nothing to fear. Still, I avoided making direct eye contact with the upright, lion-like canine. I continued my slow approach until I heard what sounded like a growling sound. At that point, I stopped, slowly knelt down, and opened the package I had been carrying on the ground. Inside it were various dried meats for the Dogman, as well as some of Melanie's personal items that I thought might still carry her scent. I included a photo of her as well, unsure how else to tell the beast man what had happened. He approached, curious, then shoved his nose into everything, smelling both the meat and Melanie's belongings. When he looked at her photo, his eyes grew wide, and then he looked directly into my eyes, which surprised me greatly. He seemed to be asking me a question with those eyes, and I couldn't help but become a bit emotional. Yes, she was gone, I told him in English, that we had lost her. She was gone. And I kind of choked up pretty badly. Well, that Dogman looked like I had just torn the poor guy's heart right out of his chest. She was gone and her entire place was erased like it had never existed. You could practically see the memories flashing in front of the great beast's eyes, as he realized too late that he would never get to say goodbye to his friend. He looked so sad that breathing itself appeared to have become an effort. Suddenly, he sprang up to attention and looked around the land with his keen orange orbs that seemed to be lit from within. That Dogman leaped from tree to bush, smelling the ground and running in circles. Suddenly he seemed to alight on a spot, and he spun around on top of it, like a nut. When that dog creature began digging the ground with his bare hands, I wondered if he had lost his mind. It was so sad to see. I thought he'd gone manic. But eventually, he emerged from his wild frenzy of digging with a big cow bone in his mouth. And then I understood what had just happened. He wanted to retrieve his bone. The men who took over the land had removed the marker that Melanie had left for him, but Leo was able to locate that big old bone anyway. If Melanie was gone, then he felt there was no reason for the bone to stay. He came over to me and plopped it at my feet, then whined. I tied my gifts of meat and belongings of Melanie back into their bundle, then tied that bundle to his bone so he could carry them all away. Then the noble beast picked it all up in his mighty jaws and huffed once at me before trotting off on all fours into the woods. I began the breakdown of my tent gear as emotions overwhelmed me, and I prayed that I had done as Melanie would have wanted. I knew that I would never see that Dogman again, and I mourned the loss of both him and my friend and neighbor from my life forever. It wasn't a fun night, but what can you do? And then I went home. I went back to work. And for the rest of our lives up until now, Betty and I have prided ourselves on being the most boring people in the state. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened to us since. So I guess we got all our weird out at one time in that one large serving. Still, it's easy to crack jokes about it now, while at the time it was a very moving experience. I know that not all dogmen can be evil or demonic as some people believe. And I know this because I saw a grown dogman cry. She's a $10 member, and we think she's the best. Please try to remember that no one beats CS. Please join us in thanking CS for making this episode possible. She not only is a $10 channel member, but she donated a big $50 to our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. And since this is tax time for us, and the new federal tax laws are so much harder on the artists who take donations, like everyone on YouTube, her donation is especially appreciated. It's a good thing the president promised to only raise taxes on people making over $400,000. That must mean I'm making over $400,000, right? So while I wait for that six-figure salary to materialize, I'm continuing to eat every day, thanks to kind people like CS. If you would also like to see me be able to pay my taxes and stay out of federal prison, then please listen to what our TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman has to say. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.